The Woodstock Railway was a 13.88-mile spur line that ran from White River Junction to Woodstock, Vermont. Although it was short, this rail line ultimately had an important impact on shaping Woodstock's destiny. The story of the Woodstock Railway actually began long before the railroad ever made its first run. As early as the 1840s, railroad fever was rampant in America. In Woodstock, the interest in railways exploded in 1847 when a map was published that showed a proposed railway line that started in Portland, Maine, and ran through Vermont to the Great Lakes region. One of the stops in Vermont for this projected line was Woodstock. There are a number of reasons why Woodstock was likely chosen to be a stop on the railway. First, in the mid-19th century, Woodstock was a prominent and prosperous town. In fact, it was the fifth largest town in Vermont in the 1840s. As you can see from this early photograph of Woodstock Central Street, Woodstock had a robust commercial district with many stores. Woodstock was also the shire town of Windsor County, and therefore had the county courthouse, which meant that people who needed to conduct court business had to come to Woodstock. Woodstock also had several hotels and inns, including this one, Church's Hotel, that was situated on the present-day Woodstock Inn's parking lot. And it had a number of mills, the largest of which was a Solomon Woodward woolen mill, shown here. In addition, Woodstock boasted a fair number of influential people who were excited about the project. Although the line running from Portland, Maine through Vermont to the Great Lakes was never implemented, interest in a railway that went to Woodstock continued, and on October 30th, 1863, the Woodstock Railway Company was organized. 4 years later, in 1867, Peter Thatcher Washburn, who had been Vermont's adjutant general during the Civil War, became the president of the Woodstock Railway Company. That same year, Hosea Doughton, a well-known teacher, mapmaker, and surveyor, was hired to be the engineer for the project. Hosea Doughton considered four main routes, but ultimately decided to go with the one shown here. It was the shortest and most direct. It was also the one that had two major engineering challenges for the railway's builders, Quechee Gorge and Shalley's Hill. And if you look closely at the map here, you can see Shalley's Hill, and directly beneath it is a diagram showing elevations. So here's Shalley's Hill, which had an elevation of 779.5 feet. And to the west, here is Quechee Gorge, which had a depth of 163 feet. So you can see by this diagram that there was really a tremendous disparity between the depth of the gorge and the height of Shalley's Hill. The decision to go with the Shalley's Hill route did face some opposition, as this cartoon suggests, which shows a prominent local citizen by the name of Thomas Powers objecting to the route. Washburn, the president of the railway, is shown as a train. If you look right here, you can see Mr. Washburn's face. And here's yet another cartoon that expresses similar sentiments of Powers' opposition to the Shalley's Hill route. This time Powers is depicted as a donkey. However, despite Powers' opposition, the Shalley's Hill route was approved. So let's take a look at the area of Shalley's Hill and see why it was such a major impediment. The maximum allowable grade for the railroad was 2.5%, and Shalley's Hill exceeded this grade. Consequently, in order to keep the grade at or below 2.5%, a cut about a mile in length needed to be made through the earth and rocks. To accomplish this, the railway company needed a large group of laborers. Wages of $1.75 for a 12-hour day were offered, which were considered good wages for the times. And soon there was a group of men working on each side of Shalley's Hill, both digging toward the middle. Within a year, the railway company had 8 miles of the planned railway line, including part of Shalley's Hill, graded. The photograph that you see here shows a group of laborers who worked on the Shalley's Hill cut, and you might recognize this section, with the steep hills on each side because it's now part of Route 4, located a short distance from the intersection with I-89. As mentioned before, Chalet's Hill was not the only obstacle. There was also the issue of the Quechee Gorge. In preparation for building a bridge over the gorge, the planning sketch that you see here was done, which shows the trusses and the internal structure. It also shows the outer protective siding of the bridge, as well as the piers and abutment. And here's a photograph of the scaffolding. Here we're looking from the top down, and you can see there are men working on the temporary scaffolding down here below, while others appear to be enjoying perhaps their lunch at the top. Also, you might want to note that there is a ladder reaching all the way from the top down to the bottom of the gorge. The Quechee Gulf Bridge was a howe truss bridge that used both wooden timber diagonal beams and vertical tension rods of iron, and it was supposed to be stronger than a bridge made of only wood. It took about 3 weeks to assemble and bolt this bridge together from prefabricated numbered parts. Total construction costs of the bridge in 1875 was $28,000. And here, yet another view of that bridge. It was actually 280 feet long and again, 163 feet above the river, which made it the highest bridge in the state. And you can also see in the photograph the protective wood covering that was put over the bridge's trusses to protect them. Frank J. Barrett, who is a noted railway scholar, has also noted that the top boards of the bridge were capped with tin so that any sparks that came out of the locomotive, or I should say the locomotive smokestack, wouldn't set the bridge afire. And here's a view of the completed Gulf Bridge. The sides are armored and protected, and you can see an oncoming locomotive. In 1906, 2 arches were added to help strengthen the bridge as increasingly heavier loads were carried across it. Eventually, in 1911, a steel bridge, which is the basis for the current bridge, replaced the wooden one. And I've heard Frank J. Barrett explain how the wooden bridge was replaced. He indicated that the steel bridge was built over the wooden structure, and when the metal bridge was complete, the wooden beams were cut away and allowed to drop into the river below. And this is what that metal bridge looked like. Eventually, when the railway was discontinued and the right-of-way sold to the state of Vermont to relocate part of what is now Route 4, the top of the bridge, the deck portion, was covered with concrete to make the current highway bridge. After completing the bridge, from there, the railway workers continued to lay track, and you can see it required a significant amount of excavation work. When the tracks were completed, it was then time to test the railway. The Winooski, which was a 23-ton locomotive, tested the Quechee Gulf Bridge on August 12, 1875. Apparently 2,500 people turned out to watch the event, and the bridge supposedly sank no more than a quarter inch under the weight of the train. One can only imagine what it felt like to be the engineer of the locomotive traveling across that bridge for the first time, which actually reminds me of a story of a man. He was known as, quote unquote, Fearless Philo, and he was a worker who helped to build the Quechee Gulf Bridge. And he used to show his feats of so-called bravery by standing on his head on the train tracks during the noon hour to the delight of onlookers. According to local lore, he later selected a tree by the gorge and he cut off the tree's branches as well as the top of the tree so there was a 4-inch base. He would then do headstands while kicking his feet in the air 190 feet above the ground. Apparently the first time he tried this trick, there were some coins in his pocket, which ended up at the bottom of the gorge. The Woodstock Railway's main stops after leaving White River Junction included Dewey's Mills, Quechee, Tassville, and Woodstock. And so I thought we would go through those stops next. The Dewey's Mills stop was located right next to the Quechee Gulf Bridge. The mill complex that was associated with the Dewey's Mill stop was located in the hamlet of Queechee, where Simon Pierce is now located. The mill was established in 1836 and ultimately grew into a large operation that employed over 100 people and had about 64 buildings. Peter Washburn, the then president of the Woodstock Railway, died in February of 1870 while also serving as governor of Vermont. The new president of the Woodstock Railway, after Washburn died, was Albert Dewey, who was president of Dewey's Mills. And Dewey is shown in this photograph, standing right here in front of the office. Dewey's Mill was really an extensive mill complex. It was a site, I'm told, that at one time had had the contract to make uniforms for both the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees. It was also the site of the first shoddy mill in the United States. Shoddy was a type of cloth that was made from processed rags and leftover scraps and cuttings from tailors. And for those who might be interested in word origins, we still use the word shoddy today. However, instead of referring to cloth, it's generally used to refer to something that's poorly made or of inferior quality. This term first came into common parlance back in the latter part of the 19th century through the textile manufacturing industry because of the creation of the cloth called shoddy. Incidentally, the shoddy maker that was used in Queechee was manufactured by Reuben Daniels, who had his shop in West Woodstock, near where the Woodstock Farmers Market now stands. The next stop on the Woodstock Railway, past the Dewey's Mill stop, if you were headed west, was the Queechee Station, which is shown here. And you can see by the detail map that this stop had a passenger depot, a cattle shed, and a section house. And here is a photo that I believe is taken in front of that Queechee Station cattle shed. It shows cattle boarding the cattle car. Woodstock also had a cattle shed, but again, I believe this one was Queechee. The next stop after the Queechee Station, if headed west, was Tassville. And this is a view from across the river looking southwest over the hamlet of Tassville. It was taken about 1915. And just to orient you, over here on the left is the Tassville Covered Bridge, which was constructed back in 1836 and was 190 feet long. The Woodstock Railway is shown running through the hamlet. Here's the station, here's the powerhouse, and this large building is no longer in existence, but this was the manufacturing building used by the Taft brothers, who manufactured a variety of tools and implements. And here's a map showing the layout of that Tassville station. And you may notice that some of the landmarks, such as the powerhouse, the dam, and the bridge, are still in existence today. As an interesting side note, students who were living in Tassville used to ride the train to high school. The train would pick them up in Tassville and take them to the depot located at the eastern end of Woodstock Village. And from there, the students would walk to the high school, which was located at that time on South Street in the general area of where the Woodstock Elementary School now stands. If you left Tassville and were headed west, the next stop on the Woodstock Railway was the Woodstock Depot, which ultimately became the terminus of the railway. Originally, plans had included going through to Bridgewater and then on to Rutland, but those plans were never realized. The trip from White River Junction to Woodstock took between 40 and 45 minutes, and the train's normal operating schedule was to make 2 round trips a day, 6 days a week. When passengers arrived in Woodstock, they would have seen a robust area that included a passenger house, freight house, engine house, turntable, section house, cattle shed, storehouse, and a Standard Oil building. And here we have a photograph that shows that main passenger house that was located right on Pleasant Street, here being the street. And you'll notice with this passenger house, the wide overhanging eaves and the very distinctive tower-like structure at the back. And over here are the railroad tracks. And here are those tracks again, this time from a different vantage point, where the tracks are in the midground of the picture and the passenger building in the background. And here's yet another photograph at the depot. This photograph was probably taken in the 1890s. It shows the Woodstock Inn's horse-drawn coach at the station, which was eventually replaced with an electric bus. The period from about 1890 to 1915 was really the heyday of the Woodstock Railway. The railway was prospering as it transported outbound such things as wool, logs, livestock, agricultural products, and transported inbound such things as coal, grain, flour, cement, fertilizer, sugar, and people. And I want to put a special emphasis on people because this really was the period where tourism took off and many people came to Woodstock to visit. And ultimately, it set the stage for Woodstock becoming a tourist destination. Many people who rode the railway or lived near it have fond remembrances of it. And while I don't have time to share a lot of those remembrances, I will share one that was written by Woodstock resident Dave Farley, who remembered one Halloween at the depot. Mr. Farley wrote, "I also remember one Halloween night about 1930, 1932, when all the various gangs of looking for something to get into converged on the railroad station. There was a freight car in front of Gillingham's warehouse, a coal car at Gilchrist's coal chute, and one or two others around. We pushed and pulled and moved all these around and left one on the hand-moved turntable between the tracks and one parked in front of the shed where the engine in Woodstock was parked for the night. Satisfied that we had really mixed things up, we went our way for other mischief. The next morning at school, comparing notes on Halloween activities, we were greeted by news from the depot area kids that the railroad was hardly bothered." Given such memories, it was a sad day for many when the railroad closed and ceased operations in 1933. There were many factors that contributed to the demise of the railway, but most were due to declining revenue. For instance, in 1927, there was a major flood, and this flood damaged the train's railbed and caused 15 major washouts. It took several weeks to rebuild the damaged parts of the line and months more to repair the connecting roads that allowed people to access the railway, thus impacting the railway's ability to function for a number of months. Other losses of revenue were caused by the Great Depression. Passenger travel declined from nearly 16,000 people in 1927 to 2,438 by 1931. The various mills, including Dewey's and Parker's mills in Quechee, had also decreased production during the Depression, thereby reducing the use of the railway. Still another loss of income came when the local electric company tapped into Vermont's hydro system and they no longer shipped coal via the railway. In all these cases, the railway lost income, which put a financial strain on the railroad. In addition, in 1930, there was a brush fire that destroyed 3 out of 4 pieces of the railway passengers' equipment, including a baggage car, combination car number 4, and coach number 6. These pieces were going to be expensive to replace. And then, of course, there was the advent of the automobile. The automobile gave people far more freedom to choose where and when they traveled, and it soon became the favored mode of transportation. Lastly, there was the death of Richard Billings, who had been named the railway's president. He had written out notes for the struggling railway shortly after his death, and many of these notes needed to be repaid. The final run of the Woodstock Railway took place Saturday, April 15th, 1933. That day, the H.H. Payne left Woodstock for its last official run. Of the 350 passengers who rode the train that day to White River Junction, 14 had been on the first train ride back in 1875, 58 years earlier. One of the most memorable parts of the day for many people happened while en route between Woodstock and White River Junction. As the train tried to climb Shalley's Hill, which was the steepest part of the trip, it found it could not scale the grade, and the train had to back down as far as the Dewey's Mill station. But even after trying again, it was unable to make the hill. Upon investigation, the reason became clear. The track had been greased. The engine had to separate and leave one of the passenger cars that it was pulling behind on the Quechee Gulf Bridge as the others were drawn over the hill. The guests arrived late in White River Junction, where there was a reception for the passengers. The three pranksters who were involved with greasing the tracks were Dean George, Stanley Booth Spencer, and Primo Capron. They lathered the tracks at the steepest part of the mile-long Challis Hill with wagon axle grease the night before. John French, the railroad's president, was described as being so vexed by the stunt that for the first time ever, he was known to have used, quote unquote, strong language. The three pranksters got the inspiration for greasing the tracks after reading a magazine account that told how locusts were so thick out west that they could make the tracks slippery and stop a train. The night before, they had first tried to apply soft soap to the tracks, but after a heavy rain that night, the soap washed off. So the three went back to the Capron store, which was owned by Primo Capron's father, and they got a 3-pound can of axle grease and went back to the track to grease it. From a hill on his father's farm, which is now known as Marshland Farm, George, the next day, was able to watch the whole thing as it unwound using binoculars. Apparently, when he saw the trouble unfolding, he did become very concerned that someone might get injured. Luckily, that was not the case. The secret was kept for 60 years, and despite efforts to identify the pranksters, their identities only became public when Dean George finally shared the story in 1993, some 60 years after the event, and after his two friends had passed away. Following that fateful day, during the summer of 1933, the H.H. Payne was used to take up the rails of the Woodstock Railway. Part of the U.S. Route 4 was then relocated over where the train had formerly run. And here are two images of the Challis Hill Cut area, close to the area where we have the intersection of I-89. And it shows what the area looked like in the 1870s and what it looks like now. And you can see very clearly the same sort of hills and the fact that the Route 4 was placed over the train tracks that had been there before. As for the railway's impact, because of the railway, Woodstock transitioned from an agrarian community with a strong manufacturing-based economy into one where tourism became an increasingly important part of the town's economic engine. The Woodstock Inn, built in 1892, was one of just several inns and hotels which were built to accommodate the many guests who came to visit from far-off cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, because the Woodstock Railway made travel to Woodstock convenient. The railway's legacy also lives on through the structures at the old depot. The main part of the depot, the old passenger building, still stands on the site. For a number of years, it was adapted to serve a variety of functions ranging from a diner to a parts store. However, in more recent years, it's been renovated so that it looks similar to how it looked when it was being used by the railway. Another site that still remains at the old depot is the turntable site. This photo shows what it looks like today. And if you go down to the old depot, you'll see that there are many changes going on, both with the East End Park and the Ottaquechee Trail, as well as be able to see these structures. Thus ends the story of the Woodstock Railway. Again, it was a short 13.88-mile spur line that left an indelible mark on Woodstock's history. For those who are interested in learning more about this railway line, there are several books that have been published on this topic, including ones by Frank J. Barrett and Edgar Mead. There's also a terrific article on the Woodstock Railway by Robert C. Jones entitled Historical Modeling, the Woodstock Railway. The Woodstock History Center, located in Woodstock, Vermont, has some of these resources, as well as an extensive collection of photographs and ephemera related to the Woodstock Railway.